Darius Monroe, a successful black CEO of a luxury retail chain, discovers one of his store managers, Ethan Sullivan, discriminating against customers based on appearance. Going undercover, Darius experiences the prejudice firsthand and confronts Ethan. Instead of firing him, Darius gives Ethan a chance to change by requiring him to treat all customers with respect. Over time, Ethan shows genuine improvement, and Darius implements diversity and inclusion training across his company. The story explores themes of prejudice, leadership, and accountability, as Darius ensures that his brand reflects the values of equality and respect for everyone. Welcome to today's story. Before we begin, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next exciting stories. Let's enjoy. Darius Monroe stood at the floor-to-ceiling window of his corner office, staring out at the skyline of New York City. The city seemed to pulse with energy, the kind that never allowed anyone to stop moving, to stop striving. For most people, the relentless hustle could be exhausting, but for Darius, it had become a kind of fuel, driving him ever forward in his journey. Even now, with his empire of luxury retail stores stretching from coast to coast, he felt that same drive pushing him. It was a drive that had gotten him to where he was today, but it was also a drive that never let him rest. Even as he stood in his towering Manhattan office, an office that represented everything he had built, he couldn't help but feel a sense of unease creeping into his mind. He had worked too hard, sacrificed too much to let things slip now. As he watched the city unfold beneath him, the vibrant streets busy with people hurrying from place to place, Darius couldn't help but think about how different his life might have been. He had grown up just a few miles away, but it might as well have been a different world. Harlem, the place where he had spent his childhood, was a far cry from the gleaming skyscrapers and polished office towers of Midtown Manhattan. Darius could still remember the sounds of the streets he had grown up on, the distant rumble of trains, the voices of street vendors, and the laughter of children playing in the cracked asphalt playgrounds. His parents, both hardworking and proud, had instilled in him a belief that he could rise above the circumstances of his birth. But even with their encouragement, Darius had felt the weight of the world's expectations on his shoulders from a young age. Teachers told him to aim for something realistic. Neighbors gave him polite but knowing smiles when he talked about his dreams of becoming a businessman. And his classmates? Well, they were quick to remind him that kids like him didn't become CEOs. They became employees, working for the CEOs. And even as a child, Darius had felt the sting of being underestimated. But that was what had driven him all these years, wasn't it? The constant need to prove people wrong, to show that their assumptions about him, about black men like him, were wrong. He had worked his way up, first as a hungry entrepreneur with nothing more than a small line of credit and an idea, then as the head of a multi-million-dollar luxury retail chain that catered to the country's elite. But despite everything he had achieved, Darius knew that the world hadn't changed as much as he had. The prejudice he had faced as a child hadn't disappeared just because he was wealthy now. It had simply taken on a new, more insidious form, polished and polite, hidden behind smiles and handshakes. His phone buzzed, pulling him from his thoughts. Lauren Carter, his assistant, was calling. He answered immediately, her voice coming through the speaker with a sense of urgency. "Darius," Lauren began, "we've got a problem." "What's going on?" he asked, already suspecting the answer. "It's the Soho store," she said. "I've been hearing some troubling reports. There are complaints. Customers are saying they're being treated differently. And from what I've gathered, it seems to be about more than just bad service." Darius's grip tightened on his phone. "Different how?" Lauren hesitated before answering, her voice dropping slightly. "It's subtle, but it sounds like racial profiling. Customers who don't fit a certain image are being ignored or dismissed. And apparently the manager, Ethan Sullivan, has been at the center of it." Darius felt his heart sink. Ethan had been with the company for years, and his sales numbers were always stellar. On paper, he was one of their best managers, with connections to some of the wealthiest clients in the city. But numbers weren't everything, and Darius had learned that long ago. "What exactly are they saying about Ethan?" Darius asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "They say he's catering exclusively to high-end clients," Lauren explained, "and anyone who doesn't look like they belong is either ignored or treated poorly." "I've heard the same complaint from multiple people now." Darius took a deep breath, trying to process the information. He had always prided himself on creating a company that was inclusive, a place where anyone who valued quality could feel welcome. And yet, here he was, hearing that one of his own stores, one of his flagship locations no less, was becoming the very thing he had worked so hard to avoid. "Are you sure?" Darius asked, though he already knew the answer. Lauren paused. "I'm sure, Darius. I've heard enough to know that something's not right." Darius closed his eyes for a moment, the weight of the situation settling over him. This wasn't just about one store manager. It was about everything he had built. If Ethan's behavior was as bad as the rumors suggested, it wasn't just a personal failure. It was a failure of the company, a failure of the values Darius had tried to instill in every one of his employees. "I need to see it for myself," Darius said finally. "I'm going to the Soho store." Lauren's voice took on a note of concern. "Are you sure that's a good idea? If they know you're coming, they'll be on their best behavior." "That's why I'm not going as myself," Darius replied, already making plans in his mind. "I'm going undercover." Later that day, Darius found himself standing in front of his walk-in closet, staring at the rows of expensive suits, designer shoes, and luxury watches that lined the shelves. Normally, he would have reached for one of his finest tailored suits, the kind that exuded power and success. But today was different. Today, he wasn't Darius Monroe, CEO of a multi-million-dollar luxury retail empire. Today, he was just another man walking into a store where, according to the complaints, he wouldn't be welcome. He reached for a simple black hoodie, one that had been tucked away in the back of the closet for years. It was worn but comfortable, a far cry from the high-end clothing he usually wore. He paired it with a plain pair of jeans and sneakers. The Rolex that usually adorned his wrist stayed behind, replaced by an old digital watch he had bought in his early days of hustling, long before he could afford any luxury brands. As he dressed, memories of his past life flooded his mind. Memories of being turned away from stores, of being followed by security guards who assumed that he was there to steal, not to shop. Memories of being judged not by his character or his ambition, but by the color of his skin. Those memories were what had driven him to create his company in the first place. He had wanted to build something different, something that would make everyone feel valued. But now, the very thing he had created was being tarnished by the same prejudices he had fought so hard to overcome. He stared at himself in the mirror, his reflection almost unrecognizable. In his hoodie and jeans, he looked like the man he had been before the millions, before success. He looked like the man who had to fight for every inch of respect in a world that had already made its judgments about him. And that was exactly the point. His phone buzzed with a message from Lauren. "Everything's set. They won't know you're coming." Darius replied with a simple thanks before slipping his phone into his pocket. He had done this before, in the early days of his company, when he wanted to test the customer experience without the staff knowing who he was. But back then, it had been about improving service. Now it was about something much deeper. This time, it wasn't just about catching a manager or two slacking off. This was about confronting a toxic mindset that had taken root in his company, a mindset that said certain people didn't belong in luxury spaces. As he grabbed his keys and left his penthouse, Darius couldn't shake the feeling that this was about more than just the Soho store. This was about confronting the larger issues that had followed him his entire life. No matter how successful he became, no matter how much wealth and power he accumulated, there would always be people who saw him as lesser, people who didn't think he belonged. And now it seemed that those same people were working for him. The Soho store was one of Darius's largest and most profitable locations, a gleaming jewel in the crown of his retail empire. Nestled in the heart of Manhattan's upscale shopping district, the store was a destination for tourists, socialites, and the city's elite. Its sleek black and gold exterior gleamed in the late afternoon light, drawing the attention of passers-by with its promise of luxury. But as Darius approached the entrance, dressed in his hoodie and jeans, he felt a familiar sense of apprehension. It had been years since he had walked into a store as anything other than the owner, but the memories of being ignored, dismissed, and judged based on his appearance were still fresh in his mind. He stepped through the glass doors and immediately he felt it, the coldness, the unspoken judgment that lingered in the air. The luxurious interior with its polished marble floors and sleek displays of high-end goods seemed uninviting. The sales associates, dressed in sharp suits and designer dresses, barely glanced in his direction as he wandered through the store. Darius made his way to a display case featuring a collection of designer watches, each one more expensive than the last. He pretended to browse, his eyes scanning the intricate details of the watches, but he was really watching the staff. They were busy fawning over a wealthy-looking couple dressed in tailored suits, offering them smiles and compliments as they showcased the store's most exclusive items. Not one of them acknowledged Darius. He waited, giving them time to notice him, but still, no one approached. The longer he stood there, the more invisible he felt. It was the same feeling he had experienced so many times in his youth, the feeling of being judged before he even opened his mouth. The sting of it, even after all these years, was just as sharp. After several minutes, Darius decided to take things a step further. He moved to the back of the store, where the high-end leather bags were displayed, and picked up one of the most expensive items, a sleek black bag with gold hardware, priced at over $5,000. He examined it closely, pretending to be interested in purchasing it, but in reality, he was testing the staff. Seconds later, the manager appeared. Ethan Sullivan was everything Darius had expected. Tall, clean-cut, and dressed in an impeccably tailored suit. His confidence was palpable, the kind of confidence that came from years of being in control, but there was something else in Ethan's eyes, something darker. Darius had seen that look before. Ethan's eyes scanned the store, taking in the scene with the air of someone who believed he was in charge of everything and everyone. When his gaze landed on Darius, holding the expensive leather bag, his expression hardened. Darius could practically see the wheels turning in Ethan's mind. To Ethan, Darius wasn't a potential customer. He was just another black man in a hoodie, touching a $5,000 bag that was far beyond his reach. And that was all Ethan needed to make his judgment. The manager strode toward him, his footsteps purposeful and deliberate. Darius felt a surge of anger rising in his chest, but he kept his expression neutral. He knew what was coming. "Excuse me," Ethan said, his voice cold and clipped. "Is there something I can help you with?" Darius turned to face him, holding the bag loosely in his hands. "Just looking," he replied casually, thinking about picking up a new bag. Ethan barely glanced at the bag in Darius's hands. Instead, his eyes flicked over Darius's hoodie and sneakers, as though confirming his suspicions. "That's quite an expensive item," he said, his tone dripping with condescension. "Are you sure it's in your price range?" Darius felt the sting of the insult, but he kept his cool. Years of enduring this kind of subtle racism had made him adept at controlling his reactions, but it never got easier. "I'm aware of the price," Darius replied, his voice steady. "I'll let you know if I need any assistance." Ethan didn't move. He folded his arms across his chest and leaned slightly forward, as if to establish dominance. "Well, I just want to make sure you understand," he said, his eyes narrowing. "This isn't the kind of store where you browse for fun. It's a high-end establishment, and we expect serious customers." Darius took a slow breath, his grip tightening around the bag's handle. The weight of judgment in the air was suffocating. He could feel the anger building inside him, but he knew better than to let it show. Not yet. "I think I know what kind of store this is," Darius said quietly, meeting Ethan's gaze. The tension between them thickened, the silence stretching uncomfortably as Ethan stared him down. The manager was waiting for something, an apology perhaps, or a sign of submission. But Darius wasn't going to give him that. Finally, Ethan spoke again, his voice low and firm. "I'm going to have to ask you to leave. We don't allow loitering, and if you're not here to buy something, you're wasting my time." Darius stared at him for a long moment. It wasn't the first time he had been kicked out of a store, and it probably wouldn't be the last. But this time, it was different. This time, it wasn't just any store. It was his store. And the man standing in front of him had no idea. He could feel his blood boiling, the desire to lash out rising within him. But this wasn't the moment for that. He had come here to see the truth for himself, and now that truth was glaring back at him through Ethan's smug face. Darius set the bag down on the shelf with deliberate care, straightened up, and adjusted his hoodie. He nodded once, more to himself than to Ethan, and turned to leave. As he walked away, he felt the eyes of the staff on his back, their judgment clinging to him like smoke. But he didn't falter. "Have a nice day," Ethan called out, his voice laced with sarcasm. Darius didn't respond. Outside, the cool air of Soho hit him like a slap in the face. He stood for a moment, letting the tension drain from his body. It took every ounce of self-control not to march back into the store and reveal who he really was, to watch Ethan's face twist in horror as he realized what he had done. But Darius knew better than to act on impulse. He was a businessman, and a good businessman knew when to strike. His phone buzzed in his pocket, pulling him out of his thoughts. It was a message from Lauren, reminding him of a board meeting the next morning. Darius smiled to himself, already picturing the look on Ethan's face when he walked through the store's doors tomorrow. Not as a casual shopper, but as the CEO. That night, Darius sat at his dinner table, pushing his food around his plate as he replayed the events of the day in his mind. The memory of Ethan's smug face lingered, gnawing at him like an itch he couldn't scratch. It wasn't just about Ethan. It was about what Ethan represented. It was about the unspoken belief that no matter how successful he became, no matter how many millions he made, there were still people who saw him as lesser. People like Ethan, who would never believe that a black man could own an empire like his. Darius set his fork down, his appetite gone. He had faced this kind of prejudice before, countless times throughout his life, but this time felt different. This time it was personal. This time it happened in his own store. Tomorrow, he thought. Tomorrow things will change. The next morning, Darius arrived at his corporate office early. He dressed in one of his finest suits, a crisp navy fabric that hugged his tall frame perfectly, with polished leather shoes that gleamed as he walked. He felt powerful, not just because of the suit, but because of what he was about to do. As he stepped into his office, Lauren was waiting for him, holding a tablet with the day's agenda. "Everything is set for your visit to the Soho store," she said. "Ethan has no idea what's coming." Darius smiled, a quiet satisfaction settling over him. "Good. I want to make sure this is handled the right way." Lauren nodded, her expression serious. "I'll make sure the rest of the staff is prepared. And Darius, just be careful. You know how these things can get." Darius raised an eyebrow. "Careful? You think I'm going to lose my temper?" "No," Lauren said quickly, "but I know how personal this is for you. Just don't let him get to you." Darius sighed, nodding. "I won't, but this has to be done." By noon, the Soho store was buzzing with anticipation. The staff had been informed that Darius Monroe, the elusive CEO of the entire luxury chain, would be making a personal visit. Ethan, ever the showman, had gone into overdrive, making sure everything was perfect. He wanted to impress the man who held the keys to his future. He had no idea what was coming. Darius walked into his office the next morning with a sense of determination that fueled him like nothing else. The events of the previous day had left him unsettled, angry even, but beneath that anger was something else: resolve. This wasn't just about proving a point to Ethan Sullivan. It was about reclaiming the values that Darius had built his company on. Darius had fought for everything he had, from the earliest days when he could barely afford rent to now, owning a luxury retail empire. And yet, for all the success, for all the millions, he had never been able to escape the prejudice that seemed to cling to him. This time, that prejudice had found its way into his business, into his house, and it was something he couldn't ignore. Not anymore. His assistant, Lauren Carter, was already in the office when he arrived, her usual professionalism giving way to a hint of concern. She could sense something was brewing, something bigger than the typical business challenges they faced. "You're going to the Soho store today?" Lauren asked as she handed him a stack of reports. Darius nodded, glancing over the reports before setting them down on his desk. "Yes, and this time, I'm not going in quietly. I'm going to remind Ethan Sullivan and everyone else who I am and what this company stands for." Lauren folded her arms, watching him carefully. "Darius, I know you want to handle this personally, but you don't have to go down there and make a scene." "I'm not making a scene," Darius replied, his voice calm but firm. "I'm making a statement." Lauren sighed, knowing there was no point in arguing. Darius had always been hands-on with his company, especially when it came to things that mattered on a deeper level. This wasn't just a business issue to him. It was personal, and it was about more than just correcting one manager's behavior. It was about making sure the entire company understood what he stood for. "Just be careful," Lauren said softly, almost as an afterthought. I've seen you work through a lot of tough situations, but this one feels different. Darius stopped and looked at her, his expression softening for a moment. It is different, but it needs to be handled. There was a brief silence between them as the weight of the situation hung in the air. Darius wasn't just planning to confront Ethan, he was planning to send a message to the entire company. It wasn't just about numbers and profits, it was about the kind of culture he was building. I'll have the car ready to take you to the store at noon, Lauren said, breaking the silence. Do you want me to inform the regional managers? Darius shook his head. Not yet. Let me deal with Ethan first. After that, we'll move forward with the rest. Lauren nodded and left the office, leaving Darius alone with his thoughts. He stood by the window, looking out over the city, the skyline, the hustle and energy of Manhattan that had once driven him, now seemed distant. Today, his focus was elsewhere, on the people working for him, on the customers who trusted his brand, and on the integrity he had worked so hard to maintain. At noon, Darius made his way to the Soho store, his car gliding through the busy streets of Manhattan. His mind raced with thoughts of how the confrontation would play out, but beneath it all was a cool, calculating determination. He had no intention of flying off the handle or letting emotion cloud his judgment. Ethan's treatment of him yesterday had been unacceptable, but Darius wasn't going to handle it with anger. He was going to handle it with precision. As the car pulled up to the store, Darius took a deep breath and stepped out. His tailored suit fitted him perfectly, exuding power and control. The contrast to the casual hoodie he had worn yesterday was stark, and he knew it would only add to the impact of what was about to happen. The Soho store was pristine, polished to perfection, as it always was when Darius made an official visit. The employees were on high alert, eager to impress their CEO. But no one was more eager than Ethan Sullivan, who had positioned himself at the front of the store, greeting customers with an exaggerated air of professionalism. Darius stepped through the doors, and the change in the atmosphere was palpable. The same employees who had ignored him the day before were now rushing to greet him, their smiles wide, their voices enthusiastic. Darius could feel their nerves buzzing in the air, but his attention was fixed on Ethan. Ethan's confident smile faltered when he saw Darius walk in. There was a flicker of recognition in his eyes, but he quickly masked it with a professional greeting, stepping forward to shake Darius's hand as if they had never met. Mr. Monroe, welcome, Ethan said, his voice dripping with charm. We're honored to have you at the Soho store today. Darius shook his hand, his grip firm, but his expression was unreadable. He didn't want to make his move just yet. He wanted Ethan to feel the tension first, to understand the weight of what was about to happen. I've heard a lot about this store, Darius said casually, glancing around at the immaculate displays. It's one of our flagship locations, after all. I thought I'd come down and see how things are running. Ethan puffed out his chest slightly, his confidence returning. We run a tight ship here, sir. Our clients expect the best, and we make sure to deliver. I'm sure you do, Darius replied, his voice smooth but with an edge that wasn't lost on Ethan. In fact, I had an interesting experience here just yesterday. Ethan's smile wavered for a split second. His eyes darted to the employees who were discreetly watching the interaction, and then back to Darius. Oh? I wasn't aware you had visited. I must have missed you. Darius let the lie hang in the air for a moment before speaking again. I came in looking for a new bag. I didn't get quite the welcome I was expecting. Ethan's face paled slightly, and the confident mask he wore started to slip. He took a small step back, his eyes widening as the realization slowly dawned. Mr. Monroe, Sorry to hear that, Ethan stammered, his voice trembling. Perhaps there was a misunderstanding. We always strive to... There was no misunderstanding, Darius cut him off, his voice suddenly sharp but still controlled. You personally escorted me out of the store. Ethan's face drained of color as the full weight of Darius's words sank in. The employees around them were frozen, watching the interaction unfold in stunned silence. Darius could feel the shift in the room, the nervous energy crackling like static electricity. I didn't realize, Ethan stammered, his composure crumbling. I didn't know. That's the point, Darius said coldly. You shouldn't have to know who someone is to treat them with basic respect. The silence that followed was thick and suffocating. Ethan looked around, as if searching for someone to save him, but there was no one. The staff were watching, and no one dared to speak. Darius let the silence stretch on, savoring the moment. He had no intention of humiliating Ethan just for the sake of it, but he wanted him to understand the gravity of what he had done. You made assumptions about me based on how I looked, Darius continued, his voice calm but with a dangerous edge. And if you're doing that to me, I can only imagine how many other customers you've treated the same way. Ethan's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. His hands trembled slightly and Darius could see panic in his eyes. The power dynamic had shifted completely, and Ethan knew it. Darius stepped closer, his voice low but firm. I built this company from the ground up. I didn't inherit it, and I didn't have it handed to me. I earned every bit of it, and I did it by believing that luxury is for anyone who values quality, not just for the wealthy elite. Ethan swallowed hard, his face flushed with shame. Mr. Monroe, I made a mistake. I didn't realize it was you. If I had known... Darius shook his head. That's the problem. You shouldn't have to know who someone is to treat them like they belong here. Ethan's face flushed an even deeper red, his hands wringing together as he tried to find a way to salvage the situation. Please, Mr. Monroe, he begged, his voice shaky. I can explain. It was a misunderstanding. I didn't mean to... Darius cut him off with a sharp look. You don't need to explain anything, Ethan. What you need to do is listen. The air between them crackled with tension as Ethan stood frozen in place, his usual confidence shattered. The store was silent. Every employee had stopped what they were doing, watching in stunned disbelief as the scene unfolded. It was clear now that this wasn't just another visit from the CEO. This was something far more serious. Darius took a deep breath, the tension in the room almost palpable. He knew he had the power to fire Ethan on the spot, to make an example of him in front of the entire staff. But that wasn't what he wanted. Ethan's behavior was a symptom of a much larger problem, one that needed to be addressed from the ground up. I'm not going to fire you, Darius said finally, his voice measured and calm. Not yet. Ethan blinked in surprise, relief flickering in his eyes for a brief moment. You're not? No, Darius continued, because firing you would be too easy. You'd leave here today, and you'd take your arrogance and your bias to another company. You'd repeat the same mistakes, and nothing would change. Ethan swallowed hard, his eyes darting around the room as if looking for an escape. Mr. Monroe, I didn't mean to... Darius raised a hand, cutting him off. Here's what's going to happen. You're going to stay here until the end of the month, and during that time, you're going to personally greet every single customer who walks through those doors. Ethan's eyes widened in shock. But sir, I offer them the same level of service you'd offer one of your high-profile clients, Darius continued, his voice firm. And you'll do it with a smile on your face, no matter who they are or what they look like. The room was so silent, Darius could hear the ticking of the clock on the wall. Ethan stared at him, speechless, his hands trembling. If you can't do that, Darius added, his voice low and firm, then you'll be let go, and I'll personally make sure no one in this industry ever hires you again. Ethan's mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. The weight of Darius's words settled heavily on him, and it was clear that he understood the gravity of the situation. Darius didn't wait for a response. He turned and walked toward the back of the store, where Rebecca Hill, his regional manager, was waiting for him. Rebecca had been with Darius since the early days of the company, and she had watched the entire interaction unfold with a knowing smile. Nice job, Rebecca said as Darius approached. Darius sighed, running a hand over his face. I didn't do it for satisfaction. It's just... exhausting. Rebecca nodded, her expression softening. I know, but what you did today, it's a statement, not just to Ethan, but to everyone. Darius glanced around the store, noticing how the employees were still watching him, their expressions a mix of shock and admiration. He could feel the shift in the air, the realization that things were going to change. We need to do more, Darius said, his voice firm. This can't just be a one-time thing. I want to implement a company-wide diversity and inclusion training program. Every manager, every staff member, everyone needs to understand what we stand for. Rebecca smiled, her eyes gleaming with approval. I've been waiting for you to say that. I'll start working on it immediately. Darius nodded, feeling a sense of relief washed over him. This was just the beginning, but it was a step in the right direction. And keep an eye on Ethan, Darius added, his voice serious. If he slips up again, I want him gone. Rebecca chuckled. I don't think he's going to risk it after today. Darius allowed himself a small smile, but the weight of the day still hung over him. He had done what needed to be done, but it didn't erase the frustration that came with having to fight this battle again and again. He had spent years proving himself in an industry that didn't expect him to succeed, only to find that no amount of success could fully shield him from the ugliness of prejudice. As he left the store, the afternoon sun hit him, casting long shadows across the busy streets of Soho. People moved past him, unaware of the battle he had just fought inside. To them, he was just another man in a suit. But to Darius, this was more than just another day. It was a reminder that the fight for respect and equality was far from over. The weeks that followed the confrontation at the Soho store were some of the busiest of Darius's career. The diversity and inclusion training program he had initiated was rolled out across all his stores, starting with the Soho location. Every employee, from sales associates to regional managers, was required to attend. The training sessions weren't just a formality. They were in-depth, hands-on experiences that forced the employees to confront their own biases and prejudices. The sessions covered everything from microaggressions to implicit bias, and they weren't easy. There were moments of discomfort, even resistance, but Darius knew that change wasn't supposed to be comfortable. It was supposed to challenge you, to push you out of your comfort zone, and that was exactly what he wanted for his company. Darius personally attended some of the sessions, not as a CEO watching from the back, but as an active participant. He wanted his employees to see that this was something he was personally invested in, not just something he was managing from the top down. One afternoon during a session at the Soho store, Darius watched as the employees sat in a circle, their faces a mix of emotions, some nervous, some thoughtful, some resistant. The facilitator, a professional in diversity and inclusion training, was leading a discussion on how unconscious bias could affect customer interactions. What we often fail to realize, and the facilitator was saying, is that our brains are wired to make quick judgments based on appearance. It's a survival mechanism, but in a modern context, it can lead to harmful assumptions. In retail, this can mean judging a customer's ability to afford something based solely on how they look. Darius watched the employees as they absorbed the information. He could see the wheels turning in their minds, the dawning realization that they had all, at some point, made those snap judgments. It was uncomfortable to confront, but it was necessary. After the session, Rebecca Hill approached Darius with a thoughtful expression. I think it's working, she said. I've seen a real shift in the way the employees are interacting with customers. They're more aware now, more conscious of how they treat people. Darius nodded, feeling a sense of pride. Good. That's the goal. Rebecca hesitated for a moment before continuing. And Ethan? Darius raised an eyebrow. What about him? He's different, Rebecca said carefully. He's still here, doing everything you asked, but I can't tell if he's really changed or if he's just following orders. Darius sighed, not surprised. He had known from the beginning that changing Ethan's behavior would be one of the biggest challenges. But he also knew that real change couldn't be forced. It had to come from within. Keep an eye on him, Darius said finally. If he slips up, let me know. Rebecca nodded and left, leaving Darius alone with his thoughts. He knew the diversity training was a step in the right direction, but he also knew it wasn't a quick fix. It was going to take time, effort, and constant vigilance to ensure that the culture of his company truly reflected the values he believed in. As he left the store that afternoon, Darius couldn't help but feel a sense of accomplishment. The training was working, the employees were learning, and the customers were starting to notice the difference. But there was still more work to be done. The ripple effects of the diversity and inclusion training were beginning to show, not just at the Soho store, but across the entire company. Darius had put in place regular check-ins with store managers, requiring them to submit reports about how the training was being implemented and its impact on customer interactions. This was more than just a corporate initiative. It was becoming part of the company's identity. Darius walked through his corporate headquarters one afternoon, making his way to a meeting with his senior team. His mind was still buzzing from the latest report he'd read, a detailed account from Rebecca Hill, outlining how the employees at the Soho store were embracing the new culture. It was more than he had expected. Even Ethan Sullivan, the manager who had been at the center of the controversy, had started showing genuine improvements in his behavior. "Good afternoon, Mr. Monroe," one of his assistants greeted him as he passed. Darius nodded in response, his thoughts focused on the meeting ahead. He had called the senior team together to discuss the next phase of the diversity initiative. While the initial training had gone well, Darius knew it couldn't stop there. Change wasn't a one-time effort. It was an ongoing process, and he wanted to make sure the company remained committed to the principles he had set in motion. As he entered the conference room, his senior team was already seated, waiting for him. Lauren Carter sat to his right, as always, her tablet ready to take notes. Rebecca Hill was there as well, along with several other department heads. Darius took his seat at the head of the table, glancing around at the faces of his trusted advisors. "Let's get started," he said, his tone businesslike, but with an underlying intensity that reflected the importance of the discussion. Lauren pulled up the agenda on the screen behind him, and Darius began to speak. "The diversity and inclusion training we've implemented is showing positive results, as you can see from Rebecca's latest report," he said, nodding toward her. "But we all know that real change doesn't happen overnight, and it doesn't happen with a single training session." There were nods of agreement around the table. "We've made a good start," Darius continued, "but this needs to be an ongoing part of our culture. We need to make sure that every employee understands what this company stands for and that they carry those values into their work every day." Rebecca leaned forward, her voice firm but supportive. "I've been keeping a close eye on the stores, especially Soho. The feedback from customers has been overwhelmingly positive. They've noticed the difference. They're being treated with respect, regardless of how they look or what they're wearing." Darius nodded. This was exactly what he had hoped for. "That's what we want, but we can't let up. I want to start rolling out more advanced training programs, focusing not just on customer interactions, but on the internal culture of our company. We need to make sure that every level of the organization is aligned with our values." One of the department heads, Alan Jackson, spoke up. "That's a great idea, Darius. I think we should also consider implementing a mentorship program for newer employees, especially those from underrepresented backgrounds. It would give them a chance to learn from experienced staff and feel more connected to the company." Darius considered the suggestion, liking the direction it was headed. "I like that idea. Let's start planning it. I want the mentorship program to be more than just checking a box. I want it to be meaningful." Lauren added, "We should also involve the senior team more directly. If we're going to change the culture, it has to start from the top. That means all of us need to set the example." Darius smiled, appreciating Lauren's insight as always. "Agreed. Leadership by example. That's the only way this works." The meeting continued for another hour, with Darius and his team brainstorming ways to embed the new culture into the fabric of the company. By the end of it, Darius felt a renewed sense of purpose. The changes were working, but he knew this was just the beginning. There was still much to do. As the meeting wrapped up, Rebecca lingered behind. Darius noticed and paused before leaving. "What's on your mind, Rebecca?" Rebecca looked thoughtful, almost hesitant. "It's about Ethan." Darius raised an eyebrow. "What about him?" "He's been doing well, but I'm still not sure if the change is permanent," Rebecca admitted. "He's following the rules, yes, but I'm not convinced it's coming from a place of genuine understanding. It feels more like compliance than transformation." Darius sighed. He had expected this might be the case. "It's hard to change someone overnight," he said. "People like Ethan don't just wake up one day and shed their biases. It takes time." "I know," Rebecca said, "but we need to be vigilant. If he slips up, we need to be ready to take action." Darius nodded. "Keep watching him. If he shows any sign of going back to his old ways, let me know immediately." With that, Rebecca left the room, and Darius was left alone, the weight of leadership pressing down on him once again. He had made strides in changing the company's culture, but there would always be people like Ethan, people who resisted change, even when it was for the better. That evening, Darius sat alone in his penthouse, the skyline of New York City glittering in the distance. It was a view he had grown accustomed to over the years, a symbol of his success. But tonight, as he stared out at the twinkling lights, He felt a heaviness in his chest that he couldn't shake. The changes he had implemented in his company were making a difference. That much was clear. The reports from Rebecca, the feedback from customers, even the shifts in employee behavior all pointed to progress. But it wasn't enough. Darius couldn't help but feel that the real battle wasn't in the stores or in the training rooms. It was in the hearts and minds of people like Ethan. He sipped his whiskey, the familiar burn doing little to ease his frustration. Ethan's behavior had been unacceptable, but it was also emblematic of a larger problem. For every Ethan Sullivan in his company, there were countless others in the world who still saw people like Darius as outsiders, as intruders in spaces that weren't meant for them. No matter how many millions he made, no matter how successful he became, Darius knew that there would always be those who believed he didn't belong, and that realization weighed on him more heavily than ever. His phone buzzed, interrupting his thoughts. It was a text from Lauren. "Meeting with the board tomorrow. Don't forget, 10 a.m. Darius smiled slightly. Lauren was always there to keep him on track, even when his mind was elsewhere. He typed a quick response and set the phone down, his thoughts drifting back to Ethan. Ethan Sullivan was a product of a system that had taught him to see people like Darius as less than. A system that had been built on exclusion, on the idea that luxury and success were reserved for a select few. Darius had spent his entire life fighting against that system, proving that it was possible to break through the barriers that society had created. But even now, as the CEO of a multi-million-dollar company, he couldn't escape the shadow of those barriers. They followed him wherever he went, reminding him that, to some people, he would never be anything more than an anomaly, a black man who had somehow defied the odds. He finished his drink and set the glass down, leaning back in his chair. The fight wasn't over, and he knew it never would be. But that didn't mean he was going to stop pushing for change. If anything, it made him more determined than ever. As the night wore on, Darius's thoughts continued to circle back to Ethan, to the subtle resistance he still sensed in the man. He had given Ethan a chance to redeem himself, but the question remained, was that chance being taken seriously, or was it just another temporary fix? He sighed, pushing himself away from the table and walking over to the window. The city lights stretched out before him, a reminder of everything he had built. He had come so far, but in many ways the journey was just beginning. Weeks later, the time had come for Darius to put the changes at his company to the ultimate test. The diversity and inclusion training had been rolled out company-wide, and the employees seemed to be embracing the new culture. But there was one question that still lingered in his mind. Had Ethan really changed? Darius decided to visit the Soho store once again, but this time he wouldn't announce his arrival. There would be no fanfare, no carefully curated visit from the CEO. Instead, he would walk in as a regular customer, just as he had done weeks before. He dressed casually, jeans, a plain t-shirt, and sneakers, nothing that would give away his status. He wanted to see how the employees would treat him without knowing who he was. Would they treat him like any other customer? Or would the old biases resurface? As he approached the store, the familiar sense of anticipation settled over him. The Soho location had always been one of his most successful stores, but it had also been the site of one of the most personal confrontations of his career. Now he would see if the changes he had implemented had truly taken root. He stepped through the glass doors and immediately he noticed a difference. The atmosphere was warmer, more inviting. The sales associates were engaged with customers, offering assistance with a level of professionalism and respect that hadn't been there before. A young sales associate named Mia Thompson approached him with a friendly smile. "Good afternoon, sir. Can I help you find anything today?" Darius smiled back, feeling a sense of relief. "Just browsing, thank you." Mia nodded and stepped back, allowing him to browse at his own pace, but always remaining attentive, ready to assist if needed. It was exactly the kind of customer service Darius had envisioned when he founded the company. As he moved through the store, he spotted Ethan Sullivan near the back, overseeing the staff. There was a noticeable change in Ethan's demeanor. He no longer carried the same air of arrogance that he had before. Instead, he seemed more humble, more engaged with the employees and customers alike. Darius watched as Ethan greeted a couple who had just entered the store, offering them a warm smile and asking if they needed any help. There was no hint of condescension, no assumption about their ability to afford the items on display. Ethan was doing his job, and he was doing it well. Darius continued to browse, feeling a sense of satisfaction as he observed the interactions around him. The training had worked. The culture had shifted. His employees treated customers with the respect and dignity they deserved, regardless of how they looked or what they were wearing. But the real test was Ethan. As Darius made his way toward the exit, he caught Ethan's eye. For a brief moment, Ethan's face flushed with recognition, but instead of panicking, he nodded respectfully. There was no fear, no anxiety, just a quiet acknowledgement of who Darius was and what he represented. Darius nodded in return, his expression unreadable. He had given Ethan a second chance, and it appeared that Ethan had taken it seriously. But only time would tell if the change was permanent. As he stepped out onto the bustling streets of Soho, Darius felt a sense of peace that had eluded him for weeks. The battle wasn't over. There would always be challenges, always more work to be done. But for now, he had done what was necessary. His company was stronger, his employees more aware, and his customers more valued. Back in his penthouse that evening, Darius sat by the window, watching the city lights twinkle below him. It was a familiar sight, one that had always given him a sense of accomplishment. But tonight, that feeling was tempered by something else. Gratitude. Gratitude for progress he had made, for the changes he had implemented, and for the team of people who had helped him along the way. People like Lauren, Rebecca, and even Ethan, who despite his flaws, had shown that change was possible. Darius's phone buzzed with a notification. It was a message from Rebecca Hill. Training program is in full swing. Feedback has been great. We're making real progress. Darius smiled as he set his phone aside. This wasn't just about what had happened at the Soho store. It was about ensuring that every person who walked into one of his stores, whether they were a customer, an employee, or a vendor, felt respected and valued. The fight for equality wasn't something that could be solved overnight, and it certainly wouldn't be solved by one man. But Darius knew that he had a responsibility to lead by example, to use his success to create a better world, even if it was just within the walls of his company. As he sipped his drink, he thought about the road ahead. There will always be challenges, always obstacles to overcome. But for now, he could take pride in the fact that he had made a difference. He had built his empire on the principles of quality, luxury, and excellence. But now it was also built on something even more important: respect, dignity, and inclusion. And that, Darius thought to himself, was worth fighting for. If you enjoyed the story, I'm confident that the next one appearing on the screen will touch your heart. Don't forget to subscribe, press the like button, and click on the notification bell. Thank you, and see you in the next one.